Welcome to Bungalows for Bachelors. Today we are going to talk about finishing painting. We're in the painting phase. Time to put some color on things. So, what is painting? Well, painting is, generally speaking, putting a finish or a coat of paint on all of your surfaces such that you can protect it from the sun with some UV resistance, make it washable, and which usually kind of fills in pores and things like that, makes it easy to clean. And of course, you can add it's a colorful layer. Color is very important with paint. So, why would you paint a house? Well, like I said before, aesthetics is a big reason, right? So, people in the old days, if they didn't have paint, they could use natural materials to kind of define the look of their house. But nowadays, we use a lot of materials that just are cheaper and effective, but they don't look very nice. So, OSBs or engineered wood or James Hardie siding, fiber cement, like all that stuff, it doesn't really necessarily look as great. So, we're going to slap some color on it. And the color scheme is very important because it can really change the look of a house. If you're using lighter colors, your house is going to tend to look a little larger. If you're using darker colors, it's going to kind of add a dark, evil, you know, feel to your house. It can be really cool, right? So aesthetics is a big reason people use paint, right? But another good benefit is its UV protection capability. So most of the building materials we use today have polymers in them. They've got, very oil based from that, like, caulk, um, the resins in like engineered wood materials that hold them together, right? So a lot of the materials we use aren't capable of standing and sitting out in the sun, and they would degrade over a long time, and they would lose their structure. They would lose their, like, the purpose that they're there for. And paint can be designed and engineered with special additives in it that help reduce or absorb those UV rays so that the UV rays are reflected or absorbed or reflected, either way. But it keeps the sunlight from damaging the actual material itself. It's going to be dealt with in the paint layer. So that's another big reason to use it. And of course, its durability in general. So when you've installed this layer of paint on a building's exterior or interior, you can, if you nick the wall, you can redo that color in that one spot and reestablish the original wall and not have to like rebuild it with the new material or something, right? You can just fix it up real quick and easy. And of course, some paints are washable as well, so it can be easy to, maintain the nice look of your house. So with exterior painting in new construction, typically what you're going to see, depending on the paint scheme, of course, if there are multiple colors, like sometimes people will put a fascia and soffit as one color, and they will paint the walls as a separate color, and of course the trim as another color. So it's normally best practice and kind of fast and easy to keep things clean if you end up painting the fascia and soffit before you've put the siding on. And that's advantageous because you can basically just, if you're spraying, you can just spray up there and get paint on the wall. And no one cares if you get paint on the house wrap or like zip system or whatever you got your wall. So you can basically just spray up there, keep it off the roof, but it's fairly easy to throw on there. And then when you're done, you gotta get your siding up. And then when you paint your siding, you could just use your little, paint blocker barrier boards, whatever, as you go, and just not paint the soffit. So it can be a little bit quicker if you got two colors between the soffit or fascia board and the wall. But that's one strategy. People approach this from all kinds of different ways. There is no one correct way, but this is a good strategy. And then of course your trim and doors, if those things are going to be special colors, like maybe you're going to end up painting windows or something, but those things are usually going to be hand painted afterwards to get them to look just right. And yeah. So on the inside of the house, one of the things to think about, even though walls have texture sometimes, is that it's still important to sand in between coats. or sand before you paint, right? And the whole premise of that is that, like, when you're spraying texture or you're putting things on the wall, we're not working in pristine environments. Sometimes people have hairs that float around, they get stuck in the paint. Sometimes there's little like nuggets of dirt that gets flung up in the wet paint and get stuck to the wall. So it's a good idea to sand before your first coat and potentially between your first and second coat, in order just to, you're not going to try to smooth everything out. You're not trying to knock down the texture, but you are more likely to knock a piece of dirt off the wall or ceiling. It keeps things a little bit nicer. So sanding is important. Now, if you're doing a large area and you're doing new construction, then spraying is an option. Spraying puts a lot of material on the wall and ceiling. You know, Usually when you're spraying, you're going to want to back roll it with a roller that's been filled up with the paint. And that's going to give it a proper blend and texture and kind of help the paint adhere better. So that's why we're going to do that. But for most houses, right, your primer is going to be one color and it's going to go on the wall and the ceiling. So you can use a spray. And of course, you're not going to have any interior doors in. You're not going to have any interior trim in. All you've got at this point is framing with sheetrock on it. So, and you're going to have like electrical boxes and stuff like poking out of the wall with wires, but like that's the worst thing. So you can spray that. So, primer, of course, you can spray the whole house with primer. And if the house interior is one color, then yeah, you could just, like, if you're just doing flat white everywhere, whatever, great. Then you just spray the whole house white and you're good to go. You could also, just spray your ceilings and then roll the walls later. But you're pretty much it's unlikely to see somebody spraying inside the house if there's already a finished surface somewhere else, because it's just the overspray gets everywhere and it creates a cloud in the house. It just gets on everything. So that's only done if you're doing large areas. Most of the other painting you're going to see is rolling or brushing. And this is especially true if it's any kind of existing work, any kind of remodel, and anywhere you can't afford to just get paint everywhere. So the ceiling, when you're rolling out the ceiling, you're going to want to roll the ceiling paint on first, and then you're going to cut in the first coat. So the cutting in part is where you're taking a brush and you are getting closer to the edge of your barrier than just with your roller, right? You don't want to push your roller up into like a corner because you might get paint on the other surface that you may not want painted. So we use brushes to cut in the edges, and then we use rollers to get the main areas. So when you're doing the ceiling, you're going to roll first and then cut in, let it start drying. And then of course, you're going to try to come back a little bit, and then you're going to cut again for the second coat, right? Get that precise line in your barriers, and then in your like joints between surfaces. And then you're going to roll after sanding. If you're going to sand, then you would sand at that time, right? And the whole premise of switching those things around is that there's the most amount of time between the main area rolling, because when you're sanding, you're just doing the general area. You're not like sanding into the edges. So you can paint the edges and then sand the main area, and that there's been a lot of time for that first coat to dry. So that's why that strategy is a thing. And then walls. Well, walls are a little bit different, but basic approaches, if you're in one area, you're going to want to cut in all the areas, cut in all of the surfaces you're doing, all the trim or anything that you're doing, right? And then go ahead and roll all the wall corners or ceiling wall corners, whatever. And then you're going to roll the first coat. And the reason you don't really have to worry about the time between the cut-in paint and the rolling paint, because they're going to produce different textures on the wall. The paint roller is going to leave one texture of paint on the wall, and brushing is going to leave a different texture on the wall. And if you ever painted with a brush, you'll know that it kind of leaves some lines, right? That doesn't matter as much for the first coat because you're about to go over it again with a second coat. So you can basically do lots of cutting in all the way around the place and then roll. But on the second coat, which is your final coat, you're generally going to want to do it one surface at a time, because you really want that cut-in paint to stay wet or mostly wet so that when you roll into it, it's blending better and you want to maintain that, wet edge as you go across the wall so that everything just smooths out. The big difference between a good painter and a bad painter is going to be the ability for the painter to maintain an even distribution of painting. There's not going to be lines left and stuff like that. So anybody can put a roller on a wall and color a wall, but it takes, a good painter to be able to make sure that it comes out looking super even across the whole wall. So speaking of super even, there are some general things you can do to help increase the likelihood that you're going to do a good job. Of course, your paint job can only be as good as your preparatory work. So if you leave a rough part of your wall that's not been sanded well, or it's got like a little hole, the mud hasn't kind of smoothed it out well, if you leave unstable or unsmooth things on your wall and then paint it, it's going to just retain that shape, right? So you want to make sure that your wall is very nicely prepared before you paint it, if that's what you're after. When you're painting and priming, it's generally best to roll the paint on in the same direction. And there can be exceptions to that, but it's, the way the paint is rolled out, again, that leaves the texture. And if you change that direction, that will change the texture. So that's something that can be kind of broadcast. So if you're going across a wall, it doesn't matter as much between coats, but if you're doing one coat for sure, like you go under a small piece of window, you're going to want to roll the paint vertically still under a small piece of window instead of turning horizontally and rolling it on horizontally. So that is, a good idea to keep it rolling in the same direction. But another little trick is that you want to roll, if you're in a bedroom and there's one window, you're doing the ceiling, you're going to want to roll in the direction the light travels into the room. And that's because most of the time the room is going to be lit up by the window. And if there's any kind of deviation or any lines that you have left over on your ceiling, if they're perpendicular to the direction of the light, it might cast shadow across that. So when you roll in the direction of that light, you're much less likely to see any kind of deviation that may actually be there. So a little trick there. Of course, when you are rolling across the wall, most rollers have that middle bar that comes out of the handle, goes to one side of the roller and goes into the roller. So you want that side to be on the leading edge, right? You're going to move in the direction of that. And that's because you want to keep more pressure on that side and less pressure on the back side of the roller where you're blending in with your paint that you just put on the wall before. And that's so that, theoretically, if the lesser pressure you're putting back there, the less likely you are to press a line into the wall or ceiling that you're painting. So you want to keep most of the pressure on that front side of the roller. And another trick is keeping those leading edges short for a first coat, and you can have them be longer for a second coat. So the whole leading edge thing is, if I'm going to do a 10 foot by 10 foot room and I'm going to paint the ceiling, it doesn't really matter which way I'm going to paint it in terms of rolling it. I could roll in the north-south direction, or I could roll in the east-west direction because those dimensions are the same. Now, the whole premise of a long leading edge is the longer your leading edge is, the longer it's going to take you to paint the wall, which theoretically means you are going to have more time for the leading edge to dry while you are rolling across the wall. And you want to keep the leading edge wet so that you can properly blend as you go across the wall. So if I have a room that's maybe 10 feet by 20 feet, I'm going to get assuming that the window shadow thing isn't a problem, I'm going to likely get a smoother, consistent look if I roll across that 10-foot width. And I just go 10 feet one way, 10 feet the other way, right? I'm doing the 10-foot dimension with my roller, and I'm going to slowly move my way through the 20 feet of the room. Versus if you were doing the 20-foot roll, you got to roll that whole 20 feet all the way down the room, and that's a lot of distance and a lot of time for that paint to dry, and it's not going to be as likely to be consistent. Of course, an exception to that would be, let's say all of your windows were on the end of the room on the 10-foot wall, and all the light was going to cross the room in the opposite direction. You might change your mind on that one. But, these are just little tips and tricks that might be helpful. If you want to learn a bunch more, then I recommend highly watching the YouTube Spec House series, episodes 109, 122, and 123 by The Essential Craftsman. You should watch the YouTube video how to paint how to paint a room DIY for beginners by Home Renovision DIY, and watch YouTube video how to paint your house and make money doing it by Home Renovision DIY for a little bit of talk on how to paint exterior stuff in that video. But he's got lots of good stuff. Of course, there's lots of information on how to paint because it's something that most people can do. But yeah, hope you learned, and I'll see you on the next one.